Are you ready, kids?
Debatably. Kind of depends on your definition of the word kid.
I can't hear you!
Might I suggest hearing aids?
Spongebob Squarepants, a show that had a huge impact on my childhood. As a kid growing up in the early 2000s, I watched this show to death, and pretty much everyone else I knew did too. Though after several years, the show started to get a little stale, and I began to lose interest. At the time, I thought this was due to me maturing. But now looking back at the episodes I remember watching as a kid, I still find them hilarious. Anyway, that's a different subject altogether, for the most part at least. While SpongeBob is still a very popular show among kids, it's pretty clear that it doesn't have as much hype surrounding it in comparison to when I was younger. Back when it was at least relatively new, there was so much SpongeBob stuff that'd make your head spin. There weren't just things like candy and coloring books, but rides, full-length theatrical releases, and of course, video games. While I've heard that Super Sponge for the PlayStation was the first game to star the Yellow Sponge, the first game I remember was Revenge of the Flying Dutchman for the GameCube, Xbox, and PS2. I didn't get it, but I do have the Game Boy Advance game under the same title. As I said in my Pac-Man World 3 review, ports to the Game Boy Advance weren't straight-up conversions like Turrican and Contra the Alien Wars were on the original Game Boy, but instead completely different games on their own. With that said, it was actually a pretty decent side-scroller from what I remember. The original multi-platform game was developed by...
Maybe I'm glad I just stuck with the Game Boy Advance game after all.
However, the game that I remember being advertised to death was Battle for Bikini Bottom.
The battle for Bikini Bottom in 15 seconds! Bikini Bottom was a lovely place, but now it isn't! The evil plankton has taken it over. SpongeBob has to save it. That's him tongue-boarding. Why is he doing that? Can't get into that now. It's the new SpongeBob video game, and it's on a bunch of different game systems, and it's rated everywhere.
Of course, being an elementary school student at the time, I wanted it really friggin' badly. However, upon retrospect, that isn't really saying much, as I wanted pretty much every game I saw at the time. And while I regret getting some of the games that I didn't get a lot of the ones that I really wanted when I was younger. Some examples of these are Super Mario Sunshine, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, the Game Boy version of Pac-Man World, and of course SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. However, I did get to borrow it from a friend back in 6th grade. Though more importantly, shortly after my 18th birthday, I decided to use some of the leftover money on one of my Amazon gift cards to buy the game, especially seeing how it was only around $4, not including shipping.
Okay, so I remembered it being at least decent when I played it back in 2006 or so. However, has it held up over all these years while my standards have evolved? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's get moving!
The graphics in the game are very close to the art style of this show. The textures are very bright and colorful, and the game just has a very pleasing and appropriately cartoony aesthetic. However, on terms of the quantity of polygons making up the models and the quality of the textures, the graphics are pretty average for the time. Again, this is a multi-platform 3D platformer based on a cartoon, so I'm not expecting graphics on par with Factor 5's Rogue Squadron games on the GameCube, but there is at least some room for improvement considering some of the platforms this game was released on, especially when considering that other multi-platform 3D platformers of the time, such as the incredible Pac-Man World 2, had enhanced graphics in the versions designed for more powerful hardware. Though on the plus side, it's pretty clear that this game isn't putting a lot of stress on the hardware itself, resulting in the frame rate being very smooth and consistent. The music sets the mood well, and there are some moderately catchy songs every now and then, but the soundtrack is very average overall, aside from one song in particular, but I'll get to that later. So let's dig deeper into how this game handles its license. What is the story? Well, Plankton has just finished creating a robot army to obey his every command.
One last review of the checklist. Let's see. Item number 1, is Plankton a genius? Answer yes. Okay, checklist complete. Throw in the switch.
However, his plan backfires and he's kicked out while the robots run amok in the city of Bikini Bottom. Meanwhile, SpongeBob and Patrick are playing with toy robots and racehorses. I don't see the connection between the two things, but that's probably the point. Anyway, SpongeBob thinks it'd be fun to have a bunch of real robots to play with, so Patrick takes out what he calls his magic wishing shell, and they place the toy robot inside in order to make their vision a reality. Or so they think.
Are you sure this'll work?
Sure. Last week I only had one big cookie crumb and I was really hungry, so I put my cookie crumb in the magic wishing shell, then I said the magic wishing word and shook it, and in the morning I had lots of little cookie crumbs!
So, of course, when the robots attack the next morning, SpongeBob feels responsible for it and sets off to stop them. So, the story utilizes the characters and setting well. How about the writing? I actually think the game is genuinely funny. There were times where I actually burst out into laughter. I'd say that this is one of the funniest games I've played, but then again, that might not be saying a whole lot. The thing that makes the humor good in the game is that it's actually thought out well, which I think is what set the older episodes apart from the newer episodes of SpongeBob. Nowadays, the humor is more random and feels a bit desperate as a result. As with the older ones, they were weird, yes, but they were smarter about it. Seeing how this game came out when it did, I feel that it only reinforces this point. Hell, they even poke fun at video game logic at times. They don't flat out tell you that they're doing this, they don't go and reference other games and make some poor fourth wall jokes like, what is this, a video game? But it's still clear as to what they're making fun of, and it works really well.
Oh, SpongeBob, I'm actually glad you're here, believe it or not.
I'm glad I'm here too, Mrs. Puff.
The robots have stolen priceless artwork from the museum. If you can return it all to me, I'll reward you with a golden spatula.
Why do you want all that artwork?
Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to handle the answer to.
The only bad thing I can say about the dialogue, and this actually is a pretty big flaw with it, is that the one-liners the characters throw out there during the actual gameplay are generally really friggin' bad. Though the rest of the humor does make up for it, so I was left pleased overall. In the game you can play as SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy. Each character has their own special abilities, but unlike Sonic Adventure, and more like some of the stages in Sonic 06, you switch between characters during certain parts of the levels, where the only way to progress is to use the abilities of a specific character. SpongeBob uses a variety of bubble attacks, which work surprisingly well. Patrick has the ability to throw things, attack with his stomach like Chuck Rock, and freeze bodies of water so that he can walk across them. Finally, Sandy uses her lasso for attacks and can swing across certain areas similar to Bionic Commando, Turrican 3, and Super Turrican 2. In addition, you unlock new moves after defeating each major boss in the game, which introduces a concept similar to Metroid, where the game will show you things you can't quite get to because you don't have a certain move yet, but when you get the move, you can go back. Like many other platformers of the time, there are also snowboarding stages, or tunboarding. Okay? However, besides some of the SpongeBob games to come out after this, the most similar games to this are Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. Believe it or not, I actually didn't really notice this until I was well into the game. Though I think that's mostly due to the extra stuff they added and some of the other game design choices. Despite me not noticing this, it practically utilizes the same formula. You enter a wide open level from a hub world and you are supposed to collect a certain object, in this case a golden spatula, in order to progress. But at the same time, you aren't required to collect a specific golden spatula as long as you collect enough to progress to another part of the hub world. However, like Banjo-Kazooie, you don't automatically return to the hub world once said object is collected. You're free to collect more of the valuable objects throughout the level, not just the ones that count as beating a stage, but also things like Patrick's socks and shiny objects. Collecting enough of these will get you more golden spatulas. So you're probably wondering how on earth this game sets itself apart from the games I just mentioned, seeing how it may seem very generic at this point in time. Well, it does so through the approach they took with the level design and even the kind of attacks you possess. First off, this game makes use of infinite respawning, and normally I loathe that kind of approach, as often it feels like the developers utilizing such a mechanic do so in order to dumb the game down for the following groups: young children, spoiled brats, extremely sheltered individuals, the current mainstream gamer, complete idiots, and game critics in order to maintain a good reputation and ensure a good score. The major downside to this approach is that by utilizing it in a case that doesn't demand it, you are likely going to completely remove any sense of failure, and therefore if you beat the game, you'll find that there's no sense of accomplishment to be had. There'll be no real way to lose the game, other than just giving up. Anyone with the patience will be able to beat the game, and it doesn't take much else. If there's no sense of risk and no sense of failure, then what's the point? How can I even call whatever it is I am supposedly playing a game? So yes, you can probably tell that I don't necessarily approve of this kind of approach, and I'm not happy that it has dominated the mainstream gaming market for an entire generation, which has helped severely damage the gaming industry as a whole. However, believe it or not, this game actually uses it to its advantage. While the game tries to ease you into it as easily as possible, the game eventually makes heavy use of strategic enemy and platform placement. You'll often have to memorize enemy patterns, platform movement patterns, and of course, what to do and when. You actually have to approach situations strategically. Therefore, having as many opportunities as possible to try different strategies out is entirely beneficial. It also helps that your attacks cope very well with 3D environments. This may sound like a silly and superficial point of praise, but it greatly contributes to the kind of strategy element that I was just mentioning, as the enemies you'll come across in the game are often defeated by using a specific attack at the opportune time. In the event that there are multiple enemies that need to be approached very differently, you'll need to have a strategy in order to actually progress. In certain situations, this can be quite difficult, so there is still a sense of failure and accomplishment present, which surprised me greatly. This whole strategic approach actually reminds me a lot of many NES games like Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man, and Journey to Silius, which is definitely very nice to see. The only issue I have with it is that it starts off really slow, and that can result in the game being a bit dull and boring at times. It doesn't help that you'll come across the same hints a considerable number of times, so while it executes this concept and flows safely, it doesn't execute it quite as intelligently as I would like. However, looking at the nature of the source material, I'm surprised that the game is as well thought out as it is. Now there's one last thing I'd like to mention before I wrap things up. You know how many games of the early 90s in particular had over-the-top and just flat-out ridiculous final boss fights? Well, I can use the same adjectives to describe the final boss in this game. Giant Robot Spongebob. This fight is shockingly epic. The fight starts off with you avoiding the giant robot's attacks, Robot Plankton's attacks, and striking the robot's weak points whenever you have the opportunity. Of course, the robot's attacks get more insane as the fight progresses, but then Robot Spongebob knocks off all of the platforms, Robot Plankton tries repairing it, and Robot Spongebob starts growing. You go inside the robot where there is a huge platforming stage filled with the kind of strategic enemy placement I was telling you about earlier, along with Robot Plankton trying to shoot you down along the way. Then you reach the core of the robot's brain and have to blow it up by shooting missiles down these small tunnels before you can actually defeat it. In addition, this fight has some of the best boss music I have ever heard. So overall, I think my conclusion is pretty obvious at this point. The game is definitely worth playing. It takes a lot of what made 2D platformers good and translates all of it into a 3D environment with very good execution. It has its small issues and it has its slow points, but if you're looking for something with at least a little substance, then it's absolutely worth getting. I'll see you next time. Oh, and by the way, I might as well address this.
No! You don'ts are destroying my beautiful bride! We were supposed to get married next week!
Did he say married?
I'll repair you, baby!
La da da la da 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 da